Hello and welcome to What Would Jesus Tech? What is the future going to be? We hear about things like artificial general intelligence, AGI, and people talk about it as the singularity when things are going to change drastically, perhaps for the better, perhaps for the worse, and there's all these different sci-fi scenarios. But really, how is that future already starting to become a reality? We received a message from one of our patrons through Patreon, and he's like, hey, you got to check this out. And the Anthropic CEO, Anthropic, if you don't know, they're one of these AI companies. So if you're familiar with ChatGPT, it's similar to OpenAI is Anthropic. They're building their own. And Dario Amodei, he wrote a manifesto of sorts, more of an essay. He called it Machines of Loving Grace, which just that title alone is like eyebrow raising. And he wrote a very detailed 5-point essay on the benefits of AI. And I think we should take this seriously as Christians. Joel, Austin, what are your reactions in reading that piece?
Yeah, I mean, for me, I was like, yeah, totally preaching to the choir. These are the things that I have strong convictions about, and partly why I'm very encouraged to keep pushing the conversation, right? And for whatever reason, I don't think I've been as eloquent at capturing, the scale of impact of AI. Whereas I feel like in this piece that he's written, at least in the brief conversations we had prior to this pod, I felt that you guys had thought, okay, actually, this might be bigger than Joel's been saying all along. So yeah, I mean, I'm very excited to dig into that and kind of see if that is actually how you take it, or if I completely misread um, what you guys took away from the piece.
Well, he
Yeah,
talks about, go ahead.
I found the piece as someone who is relatively uh very skeptical and very critical of a lot of AI writing and a lot of AI explainers that circulate on the internet right now. This is far and away the best one that I've seen as far as like I read this and I'm like, okay, I don't agree with all of it. Some of it went over my head, but I there's some temperance to this that I think is wise and very much appreciated. You don't see it very often in this space.
Yeah, and he says, I think that most people are underestimating just how radical the upside of AI could be. And he goes through these 5 areas: biology and health, neuroscience and the mind, and he gets into mental health there. 3rd, economic development and poverty. 4th, peace and governance. And 5, work and meaning. And it's lengthy compared to the average article or essay you read online, but he's really trying to give a detailed account of after we arrive at this point where AGI is achieved. And he actually defines it, which is nice because a lot of times when we talk about AGI, we get confused about what is it. And so he says, in terms of pure intelligence, it is smarter than a Nobel Prize winner across most relevant fields. This means it can prove unsolved mathematical theorems, write extremely good novels, write difficult code bases from scratch, etc. It's a smart thing you talk to, but it also will have these interfaces. And this is, I think, something we're already starting to see. We're used to interacting with a phone. We're used to interacting with other kind of interfaces, such as a computer, mouse, your keyboard, whatever, your joystick when you're playing video games. But we're talking about new interfaces here because the interface will be controlled by the AI itself, and you're going to have differences here. And so this is where some of the stuff coming out already is how some of these AI companies are allowing you to click a button and allow the AI to take over your computer, which I just think is wild to think that that's already current, that you could allow one of these AI tools to perform tasks autonomously on your computer. This autonomous agent thing, Joel, I think you've said this before, maybe a year ago, that this is like the next big thing. We hit AI, then we hit agents, AI agents, and then the next thing after that will be AGI. We don't get to AGI until we have AI agents,
Mhm.
right? So
Yeah, I
how
think so. Well, sorry. Interestingly,
go ahead, go ahead.
sorry. I think there's a delay. But I was gonna say he actually doesn't like the term AGI in his
Hmm.
piece. He calls it powerful AI. And I think one of the interesting things that he did and Austin kind of noted is he had a lot of temperance in how he spoke about the gravitas of AI. And I think that was actually quite smart because, um, for the tech bros like me, when we hear about all this crazy sci-fi stuff that AI can do, for us it like gets us excited. But potentially for, a lot of people who aren't in tech, it kind of actually turns them off. So by actually like dialing back and focusing on a fewer areas and going through a little bit more generally, it had a deeper impact is kind of like what I took away. Um and I think it's really good. Like he used also a lot of terminology that Ray Kurzweil has written. But Ray Kurzweil is totally the type of guy who's going to talk about how, you can upload your mind, you can put it on a biological substrate, very similar to how when we talked about, AI souls recently, I was like taking that angle of like, okay, let me just talk about how crazy it can be just so we can wrestle with some of these harder questions, even though they might be so far in the future, where this is like, actually, in the very near future, we are moving towards agentic frameworks. And I think if you talk to people, maybe even in the beginning of the piece he mentioned, it's like powerful AI is very near, although it may not have the same architecture of LLMs today, but it will closely like resemble that. And I think what he's saying is we're getting, not necessarily to a plateau, but LLMs have done some sort of replication on how the mind works. But we clearly know that to go to the next level to achieve this powerful AI, we have to, replicate some different models. And one of those is this concept of agents. So you have like, in your brain, you have your hypothalamus, you have a prefrontal cortex, you have like your system that's responsible for processing vision, right? These are actually like all have different functions and then they communicate with each other. So that might be for an example of an architecture change that'll actually allow us to get to this powerful AI. And I don't remember if he actually had a prediction on the timeline,
No.
but I know, Kurzweil and a lot of other people in this space are thinking it's in this decade. So, Kurzweil says powerful AI is 2029. And he said that in 2004, and then recently he reaffirmed that timeline to say like I still think we're on that trend, but now it seems a lot more realistic compared to when he predicted that 20 years ago. And that's because of the exponential growth of technology, where the next 5 years, the next 5 to 10 years, actually he did mention that Dario did say 5 to 10 years, or maybe he said 5 to 10 years after powerful AI is
Yeah,
achieved.
yeah.
But
After
yeah,
powerful AI's achieved, this stuff is because he like wanted to get into the nuances there of like once we reach this point, it'll still take time to
right, yes,
for it to make its impact on society because of various factors like bureaucracies and people are slow to adapt and human factors
hmm
and
hmm
things of that
yeah,
nature. I was interested in what you just described there, Joel, about these different AIs underneath. Because yeah, generative AI, it seems like it's only going to do so much because of the hallucinations that it does. And so it needs to have these other pieces. I really appreciated this part of the piece where he said that although biological neurons specifically operate in a completely different manner than artificial neurons, end quote. So he just admitted that like, we've Joel, you and I have talked about this a bunch of like how much can we use the brain as a analogy for AI, because there's fundamental differences He says they communicate via spikes and often spike rates. So there's a time element not present in artificial neurons, and a bunch of details relating to cell physiology and neurotransmitters modifies their operation substantially. So basically, he's trying to say like the mechanical way of us doing neurons right now is really different than the biological. And he's not getting into like substrate stuff and all this. He's just like, it's going to be different, but it can still be super powerful because we're just going to throw a ton of data and at this stuff and keep doing what we've seen the benefits with Gen AI. We're going to see those benefits in the other areas of AI, right?
Yeah,
That's the
yeah.
idea.
I think like,
and I'll get into answering whether or not I think this is like a good idea for Christians to pursue in a second, because we should hit that point and get to that. But sorry.
No, we totally should. And I think in the, a lot of the terminology he used does sound like evangelical. So even sometimes when I was reading it, I was like, the grace that these machines give us, how do I feel about that? Or like, and he even, throws caution on how many people speak about powerful AI coming as some sort of like savior prophet complex. So there's a lot of like that, which I think totally needs to be, double clicked on. But to come back to your point on, the difference between how the neurons work in the neural net versus our brain, I think on the similarity side, it is probably less than the differences. But for a neuron to fire, you have to learn a pattern, right? And like they say, these AI systems are kind of like 4-year-olds. So if anyone has a 4-year-old or has been around a 4-year-old, you can kind of think like, okay, yeah, like they can figure out some things, but sometimes they just hallucinate and have gibberish on like how the world works. So I that's definitely where they are now. And how their neurons work is like through a concept called like back propagation, you reinforce a pathway that makes it easier to fire or harder to fire in the future. And that's how that learning happens, right? And that's how the learning happens in our mind, except obviously, as he mentioned, the cell physiology allows that whole firing and time delay and everything to be different than how the computers are operating. So I think that's just, it's an important thing to keep in mind. It's like, it is similar at a fundamental level, but of course it's different, right? It's not, there's so many nuances in how God made our minds that it doesn't capture.
Yeah, I'm at this point, I'm like skeptical about whether or not we're going to get there that soon. And I'm skeptical about all the promises that are made about this transition. You have this issue with these AIs right now with how they hallucinate and how they do different things, just not to the level that they can. My friend in biology who used to work in labs, now he works just on machines, and he's like, there's all this promise around AI and government funding around exploring AI, but it just cannot do what it needs to do right now for it to actually be beneficial. And it was interesting to hear his pessimism against some of the hard research that, this Anthropic CEO presented about like, well, there actually has been a bunch of benefits that AI has brought about. So it's like we're seeing some improvements in some fields, but can we actually see an elimination of cancer, for example? He says, death rates from cancer have been dropping 2% each year. So he's like predicting out from that, given some of the ability that AI has in these biological areas where it's a lot about the amount of data you can put in and find patterns and trends and all this kind of stuff that AI is great for. And so I'll just jump ahead to what I was going to say or leave for later is like, I think we should pursue this stuff. We need Christians, we need people, whether you're a Christian or not, building. We need more builders in society. That is not something that I think is happening enough in our society, is building. So we should build more. I want to see it. The question is, will we also build with ethical principles and that sort of thing?
One thing that strikes me as an even difficult, even harder question to navigate is we can pursue building this powerful AI ethically. We can pursue building this in a way that is theologically driven and guided by Christian belief and conviction. We can do this, but we have very little control about what happens once that thing gets built and what people then take that thing and then go run with it to do. One of the examples that he cites in the biology and health section specifically is CRISPR. I'm not a fan of CRISPR. I have some very severe reservations about CRISPR as a technology. I do not. I see the potential, and I know human nature, and there's a lot of potential abuse that could come from that. But you can still build the AI thinking, "Oh, I'm going to build this, and I'm going to build this in a distinctly Christian way," and then someone can then take that tool that you built, take this thing that you built, and then deploy it for unethical or unbiblical ends. So we have to not ask the question like, we should be building these things, but can we also live with the fact that we have no control over the thing once it's built and what people do with it?
Yeah, I think that's like the fundamental dilemma that's been like talked about in the whole AI science space of people being like safe AI, right? Like Ilya left OpenAI for that. He started a new company. The other CTO recently left. And then you see like Sam Altman, I think it was either yesterday or today, come out and say, "Hey, we got this like Chat GPT Chrome extension, and like just install in your Chrome browser and like use it more naturally as part of your everyday life." So he's like really pushing it. And it seems like there's this tension between we could really use this to make significant differences for good. And then people who are like, not necessarily AI doomers, but people who are like, look, this is like actually quite risky. We're playing with very powerful technology, right? And I think, we mentioned it before, there are technologies like nuclear in the past where you can get nuclear power, which is probably still today like one of the most efficient mass generating energy mechanisms.
I'm a huge nuclear fan. I'm a huge nuclear power fan.
So I think it's like just the power of what you're developing can be used for good and bad. But does that like, how can you build something without opening Pandora's box, I guess, is kind of like the question.
And could you still embark on that knowing that, one, you can't predict what people will take your creation and do with it later on, and then two, not knowing that, could you live with your work? Like could you live proud of what you created, knowing that you might see it do terrible things someday?
Well, and then the other paradox really is what Google was faced with. I think, they acquired DeepMind. They had these cool demos. It was like 2017. They actually had probably the leading AI technology. And I think they were like, okay, we're going to be really cautious about this. And then all of a sudden you have other innovators who just come and blow them out of the water like OpenAI. And then they're now on the perceived back foot, right? Of like, oh, we've got to catch up. So if we take a perspective of let's take it slow and steady, that doesn't stop the race of someone else. And it's like already at that point where other people are going to keep going with it. Like, the DNA has been sequenced and then later on CRISPR comes. So
CRISPR in particular, I mean, like we just have in the past 100 years just so much horrible history with attempts at eugenics and genetic engineering through just very wicked means. Like thankfully those were not successful because we didn't have the tools to do that as well as we would have liked to have hoped. But with the rise of more far right-leaning ideologies in the West, again, making a resurgence, not even here in the States, but even in Europe and some places, it's like, do we actually want to have the tools to start engineering a superior race? Because that's what CRISPR would ultimately let you do. Like that's ultimately the tool that builds that house.
But the health benefits, like there are people with diseases that are gonna like want this. Like there's so much disease and sickness. Like I don't know if you've ever been to a prayer meeting at a church. Like there's just so many people struggling, and this is like
never
real.
once been to one of those.
Yeah. So I don't know. Like like one of the big things right now in the medical world is this. We understand genetics so much more. So much is getting discovered every decade. And then there's this ability to do things once we know that kind of stuff. And I do think it will lead to a world where there's going to be a lot different abilities and choices to be made, just like you can find out right now today whether or not your your fetus or your baby inside of you has Down syndrome, and so you can make a decision to abort before the child is born. I won't name any names, but I knew a couple, or I know them. They lived in an area in the Middle East. They chose to not abort their child. They're Christian, and they raised their child who has Down syndrome. And they were literally asked by people after they became friends with them, like, why did you do that? Because it's actually normal in some parts of the world to just abort any child who has a Down syndrome. And so it's like, it's not like if, some people will choose to avoid, caring for a human life. It's like, no, once they have the means, then there will be more death of these children. And so, yeah, there is this ethical question of like, we're creating more harm as we're creating the good. And we're kind of talking about that with this stuff. But you don't stop building a bridge just because some people could use it to kill you with, right? Like, you still build the bridge, and I feel the tension, and I'm not saying, like, one of the things I think the AI people need to figure out is like the interpretability of it. Like, one of the problems with AI right now is there's a lot of like a black box syndrome of you don't really know what's going in and what's coming out. So we just need more clarity across the board from these AI companies on where are your data sources. Like we should not be normalizing this lack of transparency related to how they're coming up with their answers. And I get that some of it's a black box thing, but again, Anthropic is trying to work on that, and they are one of the things linked to is this kind of interpretability, so that we can know how did the AI come to this conclusion, because then we can help guide it in more moral directions if we understand how it's making its decisions better. So again, this is complicated stuff, but there's two extremes: the fast adoption and the wholesale rejection, and let's go back to the past. And we need to figure this out in the middle. And I think the biology side and the medical side, in some ways, even though it's super complicated and we're bringing up all these ethical issues, it's actually the easier compared to some of the other things that he brought up.
I would agree. Yes, I would agree with that.
So like the mental health stuff that he got into, like he basically is like, we already use coffee now and marijuana now. And I have a friend who's a nurse, and he uses some sleep stuff to help him sleep, and it's just like an over-the-counter sleep thing, so it helps. So we're already doing this now, and we're just going to do it in the future. I'm like, that is pure Brave New World Soma, just happy pills.
Yes
He did not recognize the huge, and he like kind of said there's going to be differences of opinion and things on like or different approaches to this kind of stuff, just like there is with caffeine now. But a world where we're all kind of numbing, that's what I think it would be. It would be a numbing agent, because that's what we're seeing with this kind of stuff. Maybe it'll be more precise, and that's what he's kind of predicting, right? It's like the AI is going to create these new drugs, and the new drugs will be perfect. It'll be a better caffeine.
I know, and like I have a tendency to drink the Kool-Aid, I guess, just in general, right? Where it's like there was this protein folding big thing with DeepMind many years ago, where you could install it on your machine, like even on your PlayStation when you're not using it, and it would go and do these calculations and figure out how to fold proteins, which is a very like time consuming computational task. But if it can actually like really precisely figure out the shape of the protein, which is very complex, three-dimensional, multifaceted object, then you can create these new compounds that actually would be more specific and targeted. And I think like, yes, there is definitely a chance of like a just general numbing product, which I think is more likely actually if we are developing it without, the highly intelligent AI.
Or or if we're developing it without specifically like Christian convictions about the
Mhm.
relationship to the mind, to the body, to the soul, and the doctrine of sin plaguing all of those. That mental illness is a biological issue, and like there is a biological dimension to it, but it's not strictly that. There is a
Mhm.
spiritual dimension to mental health that biological remedies could maybe influence, but can't completely cure. And that's something that left out of the conversation will lead people to believe, this drug can fix me. We'll never have this problem again if I could just get this one drug. And no, there's still something that's lingering because the problem is not just simply biological.
So maybe that's where we segue to the Christianese that was used in this piece. There's the poem referenced for the inspiration of this heading was Richard Brautigan's "All Watched Over by Machines of Loving Grace,"
Mhm.
and even that like concept of like loving grace. Okay, now these machines are like benevolent, you know, supernatural, almost spiritual agents that will take care of us. It did leave me with this challenged feeling. So if I was
Well,
feeling that way,
he closed the piece with this line, "Nevertheless, it is a thing of transcendent beauty," which I'm just like,
Yeah. Yeah.
okay. I'm like, okay, like, slow down.
and he was saying he's reserved, right? Like this is the interesting thing. So
Right.
in this piece, he's been, and he is a CEO of one of the largest like LLM, foundational model companies. Let's call it that. So there is like even him reserved is going to be pretty far out there.
Yes.
But yes, I think that was like I see where he's coming from, and I do see the poeticness of it, but it always like gets so close to the line, right?
Mhm.
Or for you guys, probably it gets past the line.
It's past the
I-
line. It's ridiculous. It's this.
it's past, yeah, it's past the line, but credit where credit is due. Like, he does own, and we talked about this before the show. He does own up front the way that like a lot of AI marketing and AI uh chatter just goes even deeper off the deep end than what maybe he does here in a couple places here in this article. Like, does he go
Mhm.
too far? Yes. Does he rightly call out that some people even go miles beyond that, and that's a problem? Yes, I do commend him for that.
I'll just read a paragraph of his, just so that listeners who aren't going to read the whole thing potentially can just get a sense of this. This is like this is the last section, taking stock. Through the varied topics above, I've tried to lay out a vision of a world that is both plausible, if everything goes right with AI, and much better than the world today. I don't know if this world is realistic, and even if it is, it will not be achieved without a huge amount of effort and struggle by many brave and dedicated people. Everyone, including AI companies, will need to do their part to both prevent the risks and to fully realize the benefits. But it is a world worth fighting for. So them's fighting words, like end quote, end quote before the them's fighting words. Like there is that moment in The Hobbit, and people say it's not the best line in the movie, but it's where Sam says to Frodo, Frodo's like has his doubts, and Sam says to him, but there's some things in this world worth fighting for. And we do need to ask this question of like, what is worth fighting for? And in the Sam and Frodo case, and people who are more experts on Tolkien than me would articulate this better than I could, but there is a givenness. There are the things that exist that have been passed down. There's the Shire, there's the tradition, there's the family, and those things are the givens, because there's a givenness to the world that we accept and receive because we recognize it as real grace, not machine grace. And so that vision of the world that Tolkien creates, where there are some things worth fighting for, and I think that wasn't even original to Tolkien, it was just what ended up in the movies. But that vision for what's fighting for is different than the vision that is being given here.
Mhm.
The vision given here is one of technological success. The vision of a good life treats everything as numbers, so that it's like mental health is categorized in this way, not seeing the good of suffering. All these things are reducing humanity into a matter of, can we be like a machine and basically accelerate some of these things we've learned through the Enlightenment. Like he's caught up in a narrative that's very recent and is biased towards the new. And so he's just assuming the new will be better, not realizing that some of that is going to have problems with it. Yeah, so I would push back pretty hard on some of his rhetoric and some of what I think even he's calling for by saying we should fight for such a world, which is not the given world. It's an imagined world.
Yeah, I think maybe I could like get a directional question from you is, do we think the world is better now than it was in the 12th or 13th century, right? Like, let's go, because of the time scale of technological speed, and like we live longer now, but is that really better? And we have less death now, is that really better? Like, generally, are we better off now than we were 1,000 years ago?
Yes and no. Like, I mean, of course, yes, in many ways. So yeah, I would rather live today than I would in 1200. I think there's more material success, and I think those material benefits are good benefits. And one thing that we haven't even mentioned yet is he has this thing about caring for the poor. He doesn't kind of use those languages, but he feels this moral obligation to care for the third worlds or developing world, and making sure that they're not left behind. Because the problem with a lot of this AI techno-futurism is that it does kind of leave behind societies that are behind, that don't have the money and power and nuclear power plants. Like Google's investing in nuclear energy right now because there's so much cost to these things. This isn't like cell phones that can help, leapfrog a society to not need, landlines, and then it leapfrogs. It's like, no, this AI stuff is going to cost a lot of money, and it's going to be rich people who have access to it because it's all driven by the market right now. And he kind of is like, maybe we'll have to create a new economy for this. Maybe it'll be universal basic income. But they've done the massive study on universal basic income, and it doesn't work.
Yeah, the UBI myth has been popped at this point. That study that came out either earlier this year or late last year, I can't remember, is about as damning as you could ask for UBI as a future economic model. It just doesn't work.
Yeah,
people just don't
that's
work.
Like the incentives of like humans, right? Of like, oh, I'm not incentivized and all these type of things. But and this is another thing on like trickle down economics, right? You mentioned with like cell phones going to the third world, and like they actually can leapfrog landlines for connectivity. I think, at least from my understanding, is like that will still happen with AI. The reason why Google or Microsoft and all of them are actually like putting out there that they would like to purchase nuclear power plants is for model training, like foundational model development, but not necessarily inference, which is using the model, which is going to be less power. So that power is coming in like training and creating, but in using it's actually like you can run it on what I'm working on. My main job is actually like running AI on an edge device, right? So I think
that's good pushback. That's good pushback. Yeah. I still think that it's hard to imagine this world where, like, who's going to get access to the AI agents? Like, because it's not going to be an all at once thing where we just transition. Like, all these technological changes, even if they happen quickly, they still happen in steps. Like, a bunch of people started using ChatGPT overnight, but that doesn't mean that all of a sudden, like, like we're still kind of living in a world that doesn't feel that much different than before ChatGPT. Like, we still have, similar exam structures even, and all that kind of stuff. So I think it gets back to like, there's a fundamental myth that a lot of these companies have, that I think we just haven't seen it pop as much as we have seen the myth of social media or the myth of financial capitalism. There's other myths that have been popped, and the myth of AI, it's like, oh, there's a plausibility here and we can kind of hope in it, but it's not a holistic myth because it lacks human persons, it lacks givenness, it lacks God. Most fundamentally, it's like missing core aspects. And even he says it's missing meaning. I loved how he admitted that, because all this AI futurism stuff, it's like, okay, we're going to live in a world where there's going to be such economic success and medicine and all this kind of stuff. You can live however you want. You can be whoever you want. It'll be great, except you might not have work. Like you might not have meaning. You might not. And he tries to like just kind of throw out these ideas of meaning, and it's just not very robust. And there are AI ethicists that have tried to develop they call it meaning in life rather than meaning of life. Meaning of life is something transcendent, which he wants something transcendent. Meaning in life is choosing something in your life and creating basically that as a framework to live for. So you have your kids. So, okay, that's my meaning in life. My meaning is in my kids. And so they try to basically say maybe in the future, we will be able to create meaning in life, since meaning of life is off the table. Like there is no transcendent categories according to these AI ethicists. And these are the ones that get invited to the committees and stuff. Anyways,
but,
go ahead.
I think, the interesting point on the myth of technology popping. And I think the thing is that I think it has more legs. Like AI hasn't popped yet because it does have more legs in actually having a more significant positive impact to our society. Where, as let's say a technologist who's working on building technology, you're seeing, programmers think like, okay, how much longer am I just going to be a programmer, right? Like the data scientist is a hot new role, programmer's less a role. You almost have this natural feeling if you're working in tech to being like, I kind of should be working on AI, but maybe it's going to pop, so maybe I shouldn't overcorrect. But everyone's like, I do want to work in AI because if you're making like a mobile app or you're making like a foundational model, like there is just inherently a feeling of like one just has a bigger impact on the world, right? Then again, Uber is a mobile app and that has like totally changed like transportation. So I think it's just easier to see how AI will have a significant impact. So yeah, there's a lot of recalculus going on about it.
Have either of y'all seen, or either of y'all fans of Star Trek?
I used to watch some episodes as a kid.
That's disappointing.
My brothers were super into it. I would rather play sports than watch Star Trek, but I did watch a ton of episodes through them. So I know the Borg. I know like Spock. I know Data. Yeah. Like there's some great episodes, and they do tap into some good questions through those episodes.
In reading this piece, it reminded me a lot of the Federation, the Earth Federation, in Star Trek: The Next Generation. So not the original series, but the Next Generation. So Jean-Luc Picard and Riker and Data and Worf and all them, where they openly brag about how their poverty, disease, war, that basically when first contact happened and the Vulcans landed on Earth and made contact with humans, and it was the singularity of the universe, to where humanity in the next several decades, all poverty, all disease, all war, the economics of the world were just so thoroughly transformed. And yet the entire show is premised on this Earth, the Earth Federation, and this philosophy's complete inability to actually reckon with the world. Like every encounter they have with other alien races, other cultures, other religions, they're completely unprepared to actually deal with that, which is what drives the conflict and the drama of each episode. And in reading this, it just kind of gave me echoes of I've seen this before. I've seen this particular vision of this world where all of these problems are solved. They're now people are so free from obligation, transcendent from a transcendent standpoint, that they can now look to meaning in life for whatever value they want. And yet it still leaves them completely unprepared to deal with the world as is. Like, it's the biggest internal contradiction of the show, which Gene Roddenberry, the creator of Star Trek, very famous pluralist. That's a generous way of putting it. I mean, believe all religions were uh, equally valid and also not important. Like a big believer in secular myth of progress and stuff like that. Uh, and so it's just it was just interesting reading this and then hearing y'all talk about that. It's like we've been here before, or like I've heard this before.
Totally.
Like this is
Yeah,
this is a 30-year-old TV show that I'm listening to right now.
yeah, and it seems familiar because it reflects some elements of truth almost, where
Totally.
it's like, hey, we're a 50% agrarian society. People just had to work as farmers all the time, and then now we don't have to do that because we have machines, and people are able to think about like, well, what do I do with all my time? And they weren't really prepared to deal with that. But then, problems still existed. It wasn't like after the tractors came around, everything was solved, right? So I think it's almost like maybe my summary on the truth of it is we are seeing a glimpse of a future which is going to be markedly different than we are today, but
Mhm.
we can often overinflate that to be, just like a paradise, when there is still going to be similar challenges that will be manifesting in different ways because we are still living with like sin, underlying it all.
Yeah, it's one of the questions that really struck me when I was reading Carl Trueman's Rise of the Modern Self. Is he just references at one point as illustrating the change that's happened in the last 100 years. Is 100 years ago, someone would go to work and they would come home, and if they were asked, "Did you have a good day at work?" they would say, "Yeah, it was a good day." Like, because they were able to put food on the table. Like they were able to provide materially for their family. There was something kind of outside of them that made it a good day. Well, yeah, like I worked and I made money and now we're able to eat dinner. So it was a good day. Whereas now today, if you have a good day or not at work, it's whether you have this internal satisfaction, right? This sense of, you know, was it nice? Like, were people nice to you? Did you feel validated? Like you could have made tons of money, but it turned internally. And he doesn't get out into it, Carl Trueman, in his Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self, but he wrote a shorter book to that called Strange New World. Um, yeah, I won't go into the details of it, but the shorter book actually goes more into the technological factors that influence that shift. And I think that what we're going to see is like he basically predicted, like the Anthropic CEO, basically in a greater extent to biological, what he called biological freedom. He referred to this as like the idea that everyone should be empowered to choose what they want to become and live their lives in the way that most appeals to them. Basically, he talks about like you like implied is like you don't need to go through complicated operations to change your gender. You don't need to go through complicated things to change your facial appearance. Like you can have whatever facial features you want, because with AI, with these substrates, with all this technology, like with the fancy caffeine and all this other stuff, like you just get to be whoever you want. And his assumption there was an assumption that's only true in the last 100 years of like your internal feelings dictate everything else. And so this is where like when you have that kind of approach to the world, it's going to be hard to find joy in a waterfall or in a sunset, because that's an external thing that's acting on you. That's beautiful, external, transcendent. And this is his tug and pull, right? And so this is where, yeah, I think the Christian vision for things is going to be building, but it's building for others, building for their provision, building because God wants us to build. It's going to just have a larger framework than what is offered here. And so that's where I think, there's meaning, value, purpose, transcendence, all within the Christian worldview. I'm for building, let's develop great AI to cure diseases, and let's figure out how to protect against the flaws of it as well. But yeah, it's complicated, but we need to build, and
Yeah,
we
so
need to have bigger vision.
would you say then that like, has your perspective shifted maybe slightly to be like, actually we should lean in more? Or do you feel like you always felt like that and this kind of just like reaffirmed that, or neither?
this was helpful to give more data on the benefits in the last 100 years and the potential benefits going forward. So I'd say it helped for sure push me in more of a builder mindset. Yeah. Like not a ton, but it reinforced some of my instincts that I've had through this whole journey on our podcast, is that it's good to create. Like I just end up coming back to that simple truth that we are made in God's image and he's a creator God and we are made to fill the world. Yeah. What about you, Austin? Are you more of a...
Yeah, I'll say that if AI is coming, which I mean it's a silly question, it is coming, it's already here. I would rather we talk about it and its potentials and its dangers and the future that it could bring. I would prefer that we talk about it in the way that he talks about it in this piece, relative to the way that it AI is generally talked about elsewhere. Which, I mean, I mentioned earlier that he calls some of that out at the beginning of his piece, but like I think this is a much more helpful starting point, even for people like me who are more skeptical and critical. There's more in here that I feel like I have a common ground on, even if I don't agree with all of it, and even if I don't agree with, especially some of the the unjustified optimistic rosy future that he paints of it. That aspiration that like we should work to build a better future, we should have hope for a future where there is no disease, where the mental health isn't gone. And then like, yeah, of course, like that's something that we should want. And the Christian has the advantage of then turning around and saying, this can't deliver on its promises, but I know someone who will deliver on those promises. Like, to tap into that desire for a world where there is economic justice, where there is no more disease, where cancer is never seen again, and show how that's actually going to happen, not how that might happen if this wildly explosive technological development goes exactly right. It's a pretty high. That's a pretty high bet.
Totally. What about you, Joel? You're still pro tech. Obviously, you're not quitting your job.
No, I think the thing I wrestle with is like, should I spend more time on AI? Because like reading this,
what would that look like for you? What would that look like for you?
Actively spending more time working on justifying AI features and the impact it will have to customers if I were staying in my current role. So like stay in my current job, current company, and really like there's a bunch of things you could build, but focusing more on the AI because you're building a little bit more future. The other way it could look like is just being like, no, I'm going to actually just switch into a different job. That is like way more of my time is focused on like this AI future. Which could be a smart thing, right? Like when the iPhone came out, if you switched to a company that was working on mobile apps and stuff, you'd be like, okay, I'm really setting myself up for this next era, right? And other people who are like, I'm working on something really cool, which is like mainframe computing and stuff. It's like, okay, well, it's cool and stuff, but you're just missing the macro tide. So I think for me, ultimately it's like it gives me that pull of like, okay, I've read this before. I fundamentally believe in at least maybe not all, but some of these things definitely being true. So what am I doing about it? Right? It's almost like, this is obviously like the bad language. It's almost like reading the gospel and having the Holy Spirit convict you and pull, and you're like resist that and be like, yeah, okay, I'll deal with like my convictions later on, right? And you like, so that's like obviously not what it is, but it's it feels a little bit of like that.
Well, you're in a position where you're able to act on that. I mean, I don't have a career future in AI. Like that's just not my trade. That's just not my line of work. But you do. That's something for you to actually wrestle with. Whereas for most of us on the receiving end of things, like engaging with it and learning about it and understanding it as best we can, rather than just blindly accepting everything that comes our way, is how we contribute to building that future. We don't just passively receive everything that comes our way and just, throw our hands up and say, cool, this new thing, it just made my life easier. Not going to ask questions about, what I'm losing along the way, but like saying, okay, well, as the receiver of this is what I'm going to use it for, and this is what I'm not. As Postman said of television, I think it also applies to AI. No medium is excessively dangerous if one understands what the dangers are. But I think that's the responsibility of people like Andrew and I, who are not going to be doing long careers in tech building AI. Like that's our responsibility.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Jesus was in I think it's Mark 6 or Mark 4. People are like, hey, yeah, you're Jesus, you're the tecton, right? You're the techie, you're the one who works in tech, sometimes translated carpenter or whatever. You're the carpenter, right? And it's interesting to think about if Jesus lived in our world of technology rather than his world of technology when he was on earth. Obviously, he's still alive today, in heaven at the right hand of the Father. Imagine Jesus lived in the technological context of today. Would he work at a company like Anthropic? Instead of swinging a hammer, he's writing the code.
Coding away.
And it's kind of like, I just recently, our pastor, or our interim preaching pastor, is going through First Thessalonians, and you have that passage in Thessalonians that it's just like, work quietly with your hands. In the NIV, it's mind your own business. It's like, do your own work. Like, each of you have work, do it. Like, don't just sit there. And there really is that kind of impulse within it. It's a vision for work, by the way, as well, of like, we should all work with our hands. Like, we ought to, each of us individually, not be too dependent on one another. There is a good dependence within the church, don't get me wrong, but there can be a leaning on others supporting you, and ultimately we need to get to work. You have a job, you work at it. Show up 5 minutes early or more. Like, get to work. Care for your family, care for these things. Anyways, I think about Jesus. I think about, would he work at Anthropic? Maybe. I don't know. I'm always cautious with answering, but like, would Jesus
pre-ministry, maybe, yeah.
Yeah, when he went into ministry, obviously he's gonna like focus on his interpersonal stuff, but he got to work. He wasn't dependent on other people when he was a carpenter. It's when he went into ministry that he had to rely upon one another in a different way.
No, that's very thought-provoking. What would Jesus tech?
Well, thanks for listening. That seems like a good place to conclude. By the way, if you haven't already heard, we have started a Discord group. So we are already starting conversation in there with whoever wants to join. You don't have to be a Patreon supporter of us in order to join the Discord group. There is a link in the show notes to join. I didn't add the link last time. There is a link this time, for sure, guys. Thank you for listening, and take care. Use tech, find rest, glorify God. Bye.
See ya.
Bye.